Well, I'll be damned, spent my whole life trying to save folks, and here I couldn't even save the one that mattered most, Frank. Buddy Morrison stood at the edge of Devil's Drop, a jagged cliff that carved through the Colorado Rockies like gods. Own knife, the morning mist clung to the valley below, thick as cotton, and twice as suffocating in his weathered hands he clutched. Rex's collar brown leather worn, smooth by 5 years of faithful service, now stained dark with blood that had long since dried 83 years on this earth. And it all came down to this, standing on a precipice with nothing but regret and a dead dog's collar for company. Ain't that a kick in the teeth? He muttered, his voice lost in the mountain wind. The irony wasn't lost on him. A lifetime of pulling people back from the brink, and here he was, toes hanging over the edge like some fool kid, playing chicken with eternity. His left hand trembled as he adjusted his grip on the collar. Parkinson's, the VA doctor had said. Just one more gift from Uncle Sam, along with the shrapnel in his hip and the memories that wouldn't stay buried. But this trembling wasn't from disease, it was from shame. So deep it reached his bones, the brass name plate caught the first rays of dawn. Rex etched in simple block letters with Frank's phone number underneath, same as the day he'd picked up that gangly German Shepherd puppy from the rescue shelter 5 years back. Katie had been just 3, then barely old enough to say the dog's name right. Wex, she'd call him, and Rex would come running like his tail was on fire. Lord, have mercy on an old fool's soul. Frank's bad leg, the one that still carried North Vietnamese steel from '68, gave a sharp protest as he shifted his weight. The pain shot up his spine like electricity, but he welcomed it. Pain meant he was still breathing, still had choices to make, still had time to decide whether he was going up that mountain path or down into the valley the fast way. Some things man just can't come back from. He whispered to the wind behind him. He could hear them coming, search and rescue trucks grinding up the mountain road, their engines laboring in the thin air. Sheriff Bob Daniels would be leading the pack, probably cussing Frank 6 ways to Sunday for wandering off like some adult old coot. Bob didn't understand. Nobody did. They thought this was about grief, about losing a beloved pet. They had no idea what really happened down there in Henderson's cabin 3 nights ago. They didn't know about the choice Frank had made when the chips were down and a little girl's life hung in the balance. They didn't know that Rex had died not from coyote attacks or wild animal accidents, but from taking a bullet meant for a child predator who'd been hunting in these mountains for God knows how long. Frank's thumb traced the collar's edge, feeling every nick and scratch Rex had earned over the years. The time he'd tangled with a rattlesnake to protect Katie, the scar from when he'd charged through a barbed wire fence chasing off some teenagers who'd been hassling Susan at the grocery store, each mark a testament to a dog who understood his purpose better than most humans understood theirs. The mountains stretched endlessly before him, painted in shades of purple and gold by the rising sun. Beautiful country, the kind of place that made a man believe in something bigger than himself. But beauty could hide ugly truths, and Frank knew that better than most. He'd spent 40 years as a paramedic after Vietnam, pulling broken bodies from car wrecks and overdoses, watching families destroy themselves from the inside out. Well, Rex, he said, holding the collar up to catch the light, I reckon you knew what you were signing up for when you took that bullet. Question is, did I? His radio crackled to life. Sheriff Daniels trying to raise him again. Frank had turned off his GPS tracker hours ago, but Bob was nothing if not persistent. The old lawman had probably figured out where Frank was headed. These mountains held too many of Frank's memories for him to be truly lost. The engines were getting closer now. Maybe 10 minutes before they reached the parking area at the base of the trail. Frank estimated he had 15, maybe 20 minutes before. Bob huffed and puffed his way up the switchbacks to this overlook, plenty of time to make his choice. He could go back, face the music, deal with the investigation, the questions, the way folks would look at him once they learned the truth about Jim Henderson, deal with Katie asking why Rex wasn't coming home, why Grandpa Buddy looked so sad all the time, or he could step forward into empty air and let the valley swallow up an old man's failures once and for all. This old fool should have known better. Frank muttered the words, bitter as black coffee on his tongue. Should have seen the signs, should have protected that little girl better, should have saved you too, boy. The collar felt heavier than lead in his hands. 5 years of unconditional love reduced to a strip of leather and a brass plate Rex had never questioned. Frank's decisions never hesitated when duty called, even at the end, bleeding out on Henderson's cabin floor. Those amber eyes had held nothing but trust that Frank had betrayed by choosing justice over loyalty, by letting a good dog die while ensuring a bad man faced consequences. Some choices carved pieces out of a man's soul, some choices left wounds that never healed properly, just festered in the dark places where regret made its nest. Frank closed his eyes and let the mountain wind wash over him, carrying the scent of pine and morning dew. In that wind he could almost hear Rex's bark echoing off the canyon walls, could almost feel the warmth of that loyal body pressed against his leg during the long cold nights when Vietnam came calling in his dreams. The radio crackled again. This time it was Susan's voice, tight with worry. "Frank, please answer. Katie's asking for you. She needs her grandpa buddy to come home." His eyes snapped open. Katie, sweet, brave little Katie, who'd been through hell because of an old man's blindness and a monster's hunger. She was home now, safe in her mother's arms, but probably wondering why the hero of her rescue was standing on a cliff instead of celebrating with her. Frank looked down at Rex's collar one more time, then clipped it to his belt next to his radio. Some things were worth living for, even when living hurt more than dying. The choice was made. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. 6 months ago, the world had been a different place. Summer stretched across Pine Valley like a golden promise, and Frank Morrison's small ranch hummed with the kind of contentment that comes from knowing your place in the order of things. The two-bedroom house wasn't much to look at: white clapboard siding that needed painting and a porch that sagged just enough to remind visitors they were in working country, but it was home. Rex lay sprawled in the shade of the old oak tree, his black and tan coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. At 5 years old, the German Shepherd had grown into the kind of dog that made other dog owners envious, not just because of his size, though. At 90 pounds, he was impressive enough, but because of the intelligence that shone in his amber eyes. Rex wasn't just a pet, he was a partner, a guardian, a member of the family who happened to walk on 4 legs instead of 2. Grandpa buddy, watch this. Katie Morrison's voice rang across the yard with the pure joy that only 7-year-olds could muster. She stood near the wooden fence holding a bright red frisbee above her head. Her dark hair was pulled back in 2 neat braids that caught the sunlight, and her Cherokee features, inherited from her father's side, gave her a fierce beauty that made Frank's chest swell with pride. "I'm watching, little darling," Frank called from his position on the porch steps. His knees weren't what they used to be, but he could still appreciate a good show. "Let's see what you and Rex have been practicing." Katie drew back her arm and sent the frisbee sailing across the yard in a perfect arc. Rex was already moving before the disc left her hand, his powerful legs carrying him across the grass with fluid grace. He launched himself into the air at precisely the right moment, jaws closing gently around the frisbee. As he landed with barely a sound, "Hot damn," Frank chuckled, forgetting to watch his language around the child. That dog's got more athletic ability than half the Denver Broncos. Language? Daddy Frank. Susan Morrison called from the kitchen window, but her tone held more amusement than reproach. At 35, Susan had learned to pick her battles with her father-in-law and Rex's training sessions weren't worth fighting over. Frank waved dismissively toward the window. "The girls got to learn sometime that grown-ups use grown-up words when they're impressed." Katie giggled as Rex trotted back to her tail wagging with satisfaction. "Rex is the smartest dog in the whole world, isn't he, Grandpa?" "Well, now that's a mighty big claim," Frank said, pushing himself up from the steps with more effort than he cared to admit, "but I reckon you might be right that dogs got more sense than most people I know." It was true, too. In the 5 years since Frank had brought Rex home from the rescue shelter, the dog had proven himself time and again. He seemed to understand not just commands, but intentions. When Katie had nightmares about her father, who'd been killed in Afghanistan when she was 4, Rex would appear at her bedside without being called. When Susan worked late shifts at the hospital, Rex positioned himself by the front door until she came home safely. "A dog ain't just a pet, honey," Frank told Katie as she threw the frisbee again. "He's family, and family looks out for each other." No matter what, Rex caught the disc again, this time adding a graceful twist that would have made any circus performer proud. But as he landed, his ears Suddenly, pre-cricked forward and his body went rigid with alertness. The frisbee dropped from his mouth as a low growl rumbled in his chest. Frank followed the dog's gaze toward the gravel road that led to their property. A dusty pickup truck was making its way up the drive, moving slowly enough to kick up clouds of red dirt. Frank recognized the vehicle immediately. Jim Henderson's old Ford, the one with the dented tailgate and the NRA sticker fading on the rear window. Easy boy, Frank murmured, but he felt his own tension rising. Rex's instincts were rarely wrong, and the dog had never liked Henderson much. Frank had always chalked it up to territorial behavior. Henderson lived on the neighboring property and had a tendency to let his own dogs run loose, but now he wondered if there was something more to it. Henderson parked near the front gate and climbed out of his truck with the deliberate movements of a man in his 60s who'd spent too many years doing hard labor. He was tall and lean with graying hair and the kind of weather-beaten face that spoke of decades under the Colorado sun to most folks in Pine Valley. Jim Henderson was just another retired ranchman trying to make his pension stretch after noon. Frank, Henderson called, raising a hand in greeting. Beautiful day, isn't it? Sure is, Frank replied, though he noticed that Rex hadn't relaxed. If anything, the dog's growling had grown more pronounced. What brings you by? Jim-o, just being neighborly, thought I'd check on young Katie here, make sure she's staying out of trouble. Henderson's smile was friendly enough, but there was something in his eyes that Frank couldn't quite place, something that made his old soldier instincts start to whisper warnings. Katie had moved closer to Rex, her small hand resting on the dog's neck. She was a friendly child by nature, quick to smile and eager to please, but Frank noticed she wasn't running over to greet Henderson like she usually did with visitors. Grandpa. Buddy, she said quietly, not taking her eyes off Henderson. Why does Rex growl at Mr. Henderson? It was a fair question, and one that Frank had been asking himself for months. Rex was generally friendly with strangers, especially those who meant no harm. But every time Henderson came around, which seemed to be happening more frequently lately, the dog acted like he was facing down a threat. Well, honey, sometimes dogs just don't cotton to certain folks, Frank said, keeping his voice light even as his mind raced. Rex is just being protective. That's what good dogs do. Henderson laughed, but the sound didn't quite reach his eyes. That's some dog you got there, Frank. Real protective. I bet he'd do anything to keep Katie safe, wouldn't he? The way Henderson said it made Frank's skin crawl, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly why. There was an undertone to the words, a suggestion of something that Frank didn't want to examine too closely. Rex's growling had escalated to a full-throated snarl, and the dog had positioned himself directly between Katie and Henderson. Rex heel, Frank commanded, though part of him wanted to let the dog follow his instincts. Rex reluctantly moved to Frank's side, but his eyes never left Henderson. I should probably get going, Henderson said, backing toward his truck. Just wanted to say hello. You folks have a blessed day. As Henderson's truck disappeared down the gravel road, Frank felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, but Rex remained alert, watching the spot where the truck had vanished, as if expecting it to return at any moment. Grandpa, Katie said, her voice small and uncertain. I don't like Mr. Henderson very much. Why is that, little darling? Katie shrugged, the gesture carrying more weight than any 7-year-old should have to bear. He looks at me funny, like he's thinking about something mean. Frank knelt down so he was at Katie's eye level, his bad leg protesting the movement. You listen to me, honey. If anybody ever makes you feel uncomfortable, anybody at all, you tell me, or your mama right away, you understand? Yes, sir. And you stay close to Rex when you're outside playing. That dog loves you more than life itself, and he'll never let anything bad happen to you. Katie nodded solemnly, then brightened as Rex nuzzled her hand with his wet nose. Can we practice more frisbee? Grandpa, Rex wants to show off some more. Sure thing, little darling, sure thing. But as Frank watched his granddaughter play with the dog who'd become her shadow, he couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was stirring in their peaceful valley. Rex knew it too. Frank could see it in the way the dog's ears swiveled toward Henderson's property, in the way he stayed just a little closer to Katie than usual. Some storms gave warning before they hit, others came out of clear skies with the fury of God's own wrath. Frank had a feeling they were about to find out which kind this was going to be. The morning mist still clung to Devil's Drop like a shroud, but Frank could feel the sun trying to burn through the gloom. His arthritic fingers worked the leather of Rex's collar, tracing every familiar groove and scar. The brass nameplate was warm, now heated by his constant handling, and he could feel the engraved letters beneath his thumb-like braille telling a story. He wasn't ready to hear "I'm madder than a wet hen," he muttered to the empty air. Though the anger wasn't directed at anyone but himself, this old fool should have seen it coming a mile away. The truth was eating at him like acid in his gut all those months of Henderson's visits, all those times. Rex had growled and snarled at their neighbor, and Frank had dismissed it as territorial behavior dog. Being a dog protecting his turf, but Rex had been trying to tell him something, hadn't he? Animals knew things that people were too civilized to recognize. They could smell evil on a person the way they could smell fear or sickness. Frank's left hand trembled as he shifted his weight, and pain shot up from his bad leg, likening the shrapnel from that long-ago firefight in Quangtri. Province chose the worst possible moments to remind him that he was mortal, 73 years old, and still carrying pieces of a war that most folks had forgotten. Some days he wondered if the North Vietnamese had done him a favor, given him a convenient excuse for every failure that followed, but there was no excuse for what had happened 3 nights ago, no excuse for the choice he'd made when it mattered most. The radio on his belt crackled again. "Sheriff Daniel's trying to raise him for the 4th time in the past hour." Frank could hear the worry in Bob's voice, the barely controlled frustration of a lawman who'd spent too many years cleaning up other people's messes. Bob was a good man, but he didn't understand. Nobody did. They saw an old veteran having a breakdown over a dead dog, and that was the end of their thinking. If only it were that simple. Frank's mind drifted back to that terrible moment in Henderson's cabin when he'd been forced to choose between justice and love. Rex bleeding out on the cabin floor, Katie sobbing in the corner, and Henderson subdued but still breathing. Frank could have scooped up his dog and raced for the veterinary clinic in town, could have left Henderson for the authorities to sort out later, could have prioritized the life of the animal who'd given everything to protect a little girl. Instead, he'd stayed, made sure Henderson was properly restrained, waited for the sheriff's deputies to arrive, followed procedure like the good soldier he'd been trained to be, even as Rex's life leaked away into the rough pine floorboards. "Should have saved you first, boy," Frank whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "Should have picked you over that piece of human garbage. You deserve better than what I gave you." The guilt was a living thing in his chest, growing heavier with each breath. Rex had trusted him completely, the way only a dog could trust. No questions, no doubts, just pure faith that his human would make the right choices when they mattered, and Frank had failed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. Down in the valley, he could see the search and rescue vehicles making their way up the mountain road, probably half the volunteer fire department crammed into those trucks, along with medical personnel who thought they were coming to talk an old man down from a ledge. They meant well, but they didn't understand that some wounds couldn't be bandaged, some breaks couldn't be set. The sun was climbing higher now, burning away the mist and revealing the full scope of the Rocky Mountain wilderness. Beautiful country, the kind that made tourists pull over for photographs in city folks dream about simpler lives. But Frank knew better than most that beauty could hide terrible truths. He'd spent 40 years as a paramedic after Vietnam, pulling broken bodies from accidents and overdoses, watching families destroy themselves from the inside out. Evil wore many faces, and some of the worst wore the most ordinary masks. Jim Henderson had been the perfect neighbor for 3 years, quiet, helpful, the kind of man who'd lend you tools and bring your mail when you were out of town. He'd seemed genuinely fond of Katie, always asking about her school activities and complimenting her drawings. Frank had actually been grateful to have such a considerate neighbor, especially one who seemed to understand that a widowed grandfather needed all the help he could get raising a spirited little girl. But Rex had known somehow that dog had seen through Henderson's mask from the very beginning. Every visit, every friendly wave, every casual question about Katie's whereabouts, Rex had responded with growls and hackles raised, trying to warn his humans about a danger they were too naive to recognize. "You tried to tell me, didn't you, boy?" Frank said to the caller. "Tried to make me see what that monster really was, but I was too stupid to listen." The worst part was remembering all the times he'd scolded Rex for his behavior around Henderson, all the times he'd forced the dog to heel when his instincts were screaming danger. Frank had prioritized politeness over protection, social conventions over survival instincts. He'd taught Rex to ignore the very warning signals that might have prevented the whole nightmare. His radio crackled to life again, but this time it wasn't. Sheriff Daniel Susan's voice came through the static tight with worry and exhaustion. "Frank, please answer. Katie's been asking for you all morning. She keeps saying Rex is coming back, that good dogs always come home." I don't know how to tell her. Frank's thumb hovered over the radio button, but he couldn't bring himself to press it. What was he supposed to say? That Rex wasn't coming home because her grandfather had made a choice that prioritized abstract justice over concrete love, that he'd chosen to be a good citizen instead of a good friend to the animal who'd given everything for their family. Katie, sweet, brave Katie, who'd endured 3 days of hell because of Frank's blindness and Henderson's hunger. She was home now, safe in her mother's arms, but probably wondering why the hero of her rescue was standing on a cliff instead of celebrating with her children. Had a way of cutting through adult complexity to the heart of things, and Katie would eventually realize that Rex had died protecting her while Frank had failed to protect Rex. The engines were getting closer now, laboring up the steep mountain road with their cargo of well-meaning rescuers. Frank estimated maybe 10 more minutes before they reached the parking area at the base of the trail, another 15 before Sheriff Daniels huffed and puffed his way up the switchbacks to this overlook, probably cursing Frank's stubbornness with every step. 15 minutes to decide whether to face the music or step off into empty air. The choice should have been simple. Katie needed her grandfather. Susan needed help with the investigation and the aftermath. The community needed to know that predators like Henderson could be stopped, that good people could still make a difference when it mattered. But the weight of Rex's collar in his hands told a different story. It spoke of loyalty, betrayed trust, broken love, sacrificed on the altar of duty. Rex had died believing that Frank would make the right choice, and Frank had chosen law over love, procedure over partnership. Some things a man just can't come back from. Frank murmured the words torn away by the mountain wind. Some choices carve pieces out of your soul that never grow back. The sun was fully up now, painting the valley in shades of gold and green that would have made Norman Rockwell weep. It was the kind of morning that promised new beginnings, fresh starts, hope for the future, but Frank felt none of that promise. All he felt was the weight of failure and the cold certainty that some mistakes were too big to survive. The radio crackled one more time. Katie's voice, small and scared. "Grandpa, Buddy, Mama says you went to find Rex. Did you find him? Is he coming home?" Frank closed his eyes and let the mountain silence wash over him, carrying with it the ghost of a loyal dog's bark and the echo of choices that couldn't be unmade 3 days ago. The world had turned upside down with a single phone call. Frank had been sitting on his porch watching Rex chase butterflies in the afternoon sun when Susan's voice cut through the peaceful summer air like a chainsaw through silk. "Daddy, Frank, she never got on the bus. The panic in his daughter-in-law's voice had sent ice through Frank's veins. Susan Morrison wasn't the type to lose her composure easily. 15 years as an emergency room nurse had taught her to stay calm under pressure, to think clearly when other people fell apart, but there was something primal in her tone, something that spoke to every parent's worst nightmare. "Slow down, honey," Frank had said, already pushing himself up from his chair. Rex's ears had pre-cricked at the change in Frank's voice, the dog's instincts telling him that something was wrong. "Tell me exactly what happened." Katie never came home from school. Principal Hayes called 20 minutes ago, she said. Katie was there for dismissal, but when they called her name for the bus, she didn't answer. "They searched the whole building, Frank. She's just gone." Frank's blood had turned to slush in his veins. In his 73 years, he'd faced down enemy fire in Vietnam, pulled mangled bodies from car wrecks, and watched his only son come home from Afghanistan in a flag-draped box, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the terror that seized him at the thought of Katie lost or hurt or worse. "I'm on my way," he told Susan, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "Call Sheriff Daniels. Tell him to get every available officer to the school, and Susan, don't you dare give up hope. We're going to find that little girl." The drive to Pine Valley Elementary had been the longest. 10 minutes of Frank's life. Rex sat in the passenger seat, sensing the urgency, but unable to understand its source. The dog's amber eyes kept flicking between Frank's face and the road ahead, as if trying to read the situation from his human's expression. Principal Margaret Hayes had met them in the parking lot, her normally composed demeanor cracked with worry. She was a sturdy woman in her 50s, the kind of administrator who'd seen everything in 30 years of education, but Katie's disappearance had clearly shaken her to the core. "Frank, thank God you're here," she'd said, wringing her hands. "We've searched every inch of the building twice. The custodian checked all the storage areas, even the old basement. She's not here." "When did you last see her?" Frank had asked, his paramedic training kicking in. "In emergencies, you gathered facts first and panicked later." 3:15. During dismissal, she was sitting in the cafeteria with the other bus riders, coloring in her notebook when we called for bus 47. She didn't respond at first. We thought maybe she hadn't heard us, but when we looked for her, Hayes had shrugged helplessly. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. Sheriff Bob Daniels had arrived within minutes, his patrol car kicking up gravel as he pulled into the school parking lot. Bob was a good man and a competent lawman, but he was also pushing 60 and carried the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned that rushing led to mistakes. Frank respected that approach under normal circumstances, but these weren't normal circumstances. "We need to start a grid search," Bob had said, unfolding a topographical map on the hood of his patrol car. "Schools surrounded by woods on 3 sides. If she wandered off, she didn't wander off." Frank had interrupted, his voice sharp with certainty. "Katie's too smart for that. She knows not to leave school property without permission." "Then where is she?" It was Rex who provided the answer. The German Shepherd had been casting about the parking lot, nose to the ground, working in the methodical pattern that Frank had taught him during their weekend tracking exercises. Suddenly the dog had frozen, every muscle rigid with attention. "He's got something," Frank had said, clipping Rex's tracking leash to his collar. "Come on, boy. Show us what you found." Rex had led them to the edge of the school property, where the asphalt gave way to pine forest. The scent trail was invisible to human noses, but the dog followed it with absolute confidence, his powerful stride eating up the ground. Frank had struggled to keep pace, his bad leg protesting with every step, but wild horses couldn't have stopped him from following that dog. "Frank, wait." Sheriff Daniels had called from behind them. "We need to coordinate with search and rescue, get the proper equipment, establish a command post. That girl's out there, scared and cold." Frank had shot back without slowing down, "I ain't waiting for no bureaucrats to decide how to find her." It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Protocol existed for good reasons: to prevent searchers from getting lost, to ensure proper communication, to maximize the chances of a successful rescue. But Frank's grandfather instincts had overridden his common sense, and Rex's eagerness to follow the trail had convinced him that time was more important than procedure. They'd push deeper into the wilderness, following game trails that hadn't seen human feet in years. Rex had worked the scent with single-minded determination, occasionally stopping to check his bearings before continuing on. The dog's confidence had been absolute. He knew where Katie was, and he was going to find her. As the afternoon wore on and the temperature began to drop, Frank had started to doubt his decision. The forest was vast and unforgiving, full of dangers that could swallow a small child without a trace. Bears, coyotes, steep ravines, cold mountain streams, any one of them could turn a rescue mission into a recovery operation. But Rex had never wavered. If anything, the dog had seemed to grow more determined as they climbed higher into the mountains. His ears had been constantly forward, his tail carried high with purpose. Frank had seen that look before during their training exercises, and had always meant the same thing: target acquired. The trail had led them onto the old Morrison property, abandoned ranchland that had been in Frank's family for 3 generations before economic reality had forced them to sell it 20 years earlier. Frank knew every inch of that property, had spent his childhood exploring its creeks and meadows and hidden valleys. If Katie was somewhere on the old Morrison place, he'd find her. Rex had suddenly stopped at the edge of a small clearing, his hackles rising as a low growl rumbled in his chest. Frank had felt his own adrenaline spike in response. The dog only growled like that when he sensed real danger, and after 5 years together, Frank had learned to trust Rex's instincts completely. "What is it, boy?" Frank had whispered, scanning the tree-line for threats. "What do you smell?" The answer had come in the form of Katie's voice, thin and terrified, echoing from somewhere ahead. "Help, somebody help me." Frank's heart had nearly stopped. She was alive, conscious, and close enough for them to hear her cries, but something in her tone had set off every alarm bell in his mind. This wasn't the voice of a child who'd gotten lost and was relieved to hear rescuers. This was the voice of a child in immediate danger, Katie. Frank had called back, crashing through the underbrush toward her voice. Katie, it's Grandpa Buddy, I'm coming, honey. Rex had bounded ahead, his powerful legs carrying him through the forest with fluid grace. Frank had followed as best he could, his old bones protesting every root and rock, but nothing could have stopped him from reaching his granddaughter. They'd burst into another clearing just as Frank's worst fears had materialized before his eyes. An overturned pickup truck lay on its side, steam rising from the twisted metal and shattered glass. Katie was trapped in the cab, conscious but crying, her small face pressed against the passenger window, and standing beside the wreckage, wearing a Park Service uniform that Frank would later learn was stolen, was Jim Henderson. Well, hello there, Frank, Henderson had said, his voice carrying the casual friendliness that had fooled them all. For so long, fancy meeting you out here. I was just helping young Katie here after her little adventure went sideways. But Rex had known better. The dog snarls had filled the clearing like thunder, every instinct screaming that this man was the enemy, that Katie was in more danger now than she'd ever been in her young life. Frank had looked into Henderson's eyes and seen something that made his blood freeze, not concern, not relief at seeing rescue arrive, something else entirely, something that spoke of careful planning and terrible intentions. Let her go, Jim, Frank had said quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward the .45 he carried when hiking in bare country. Just step away from the truck and let me get to my granddaughter. Henderson had smiled then, and Frank had finally understood why Rex had never trusted their neighbor. Oh, Frank, Henderson had said, pulling a pistol from beneath his ranger jacket. I'm afraid it's not going to be that simple. The hours that followed blurred together like a nightmare that refused to end. Frank's mind kept jumping between the desperate search through the wilderness and the family arguments that had echoed through his house for months before Katie's disappearance. Each memory cut deeper than the last, showing him all the warning signs he'd been too stubborn to see 3 days ago. As Henderson had held that gun on them in the clearing, Frank had finally understood what Rex had been trying to tell him all along, but the revelation had come with a terrible price. Katie trapped and terrified, a predator's mask finally slipping, and the knowledge that his own blindness had led them all into this nightmare. You know, Frank, Henderson had said, keeping the pistol trained on him while occasionally glancing at Rex, who stood coiled like a spring ready to launch. I've been planning this for months, watching, learning that little girl of yours has quite the routine. The casual way Henderson spoke about stalking Katie had made Frank's stomach turn. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was calculated, methodical, the work of someone who'd done this before. The fake ranger uniform, the overturned truck positioned just right to look like an accident. Even the timing of Katie's disappearance during the confusion of school dismissal, every detail had been planned, but Henderson hadn't counted on Rex 2 months earlier. Frank's memory supplied. Susan had tried to talk to him about the dog's behavior around their neighbor. She'd been folding laundry in the living room while Katie played in the backyard, and her voice had carried that careful tone she used when she thought Frank was being unreasonable. Daddy Frank, I'm worried about Rex, she'd said, not looking up from the basket of towels. He's getting aggressive with Mr. Henderson yesterday. He nearly bit him when Jim came by to borrow your hedge trimmer. Frank had been reading his paper, half listening, the way men his age had perfected over decades of domestic conversations. Rex is just protecting his territory, honey. Dogs do that. This is different. Susan had finally looked at him. Then her nurse's eyes serious and concerned. Rex is trying to tell us something. Animals sense things we don't. Maybe we should listen. But Frank had dismissed her concerns with the casual arrogance of someone who thought he knew better. That dog's been watching too many Lassie reruns. Henderson's harmless, just a lonely old rancher trying to be neighborly. How wrong he'd been, how devastatingly, catastrophically wrong. Back in the present search, Rex had been leading them higher into the mountains, following a scent trail that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. The dog's determination had been absolute, his powerful stride never faltering. Even as the terrain grew rougher, Frank had struggled to keep up his arthritic joints, screaming protests with every step, but the thought of Katie lost and afraid had driven him forward. Professional search teams had been organizing at the base of the mountain, but Frank couldn't wait for their bureaucratic process. Every minute Katie remained missing was another minute for something terrible to happen. Rex knew where she As Frank could see it in the dog's body language, the way his ears stayed pre-cricked forward, the intensity of his focus. Sheriff Daniels had radioed them twice, his voice crackling with static and frustration. "Frank, you need to wait for backup. We've got trained teams with proper equipment on the way. Tell them to hurry." Frank had radioed back, not slowing his pace. "Rex has got her scent, and he's not letting go." But even as they'd climbed higher, Frank's mind had kept drifting back to other arguments, other moments when his family had tried to warn him about dangers he'd refused to see, like the time 3 months ago when Katie had asked why Mr. Henderson always seemed to know when she was playing outside alone. "It's like he's watching Grandpa Buddy," she'd said during one of their evening conversations on the porch. "Sometimes I see him by his fence when I'm throwing the ball for Rex, and he waves, but it makes me feel funny inside." Frank had ruffled her hair dismissively. "Mr. Henderson's just being friendly little darling. Some folks don't have grandchildren of their own, so they like to watch other people's kids grow up." But Katie had persisted with the stubborn honesty that children possessed. "Rex doesn't like him." Rex growls every time he comes over. "Dogs know things, don't they?" "Dogs know lots of things," Frank had agreed, "but sometimes they're wrong about people." Another memory surfaced as they'd pushed deeper into the wilderness last month. Susan had mentioned finding Henderson in their yard when she'd come home from her shift at the hospital. He'd claimed to be looking for his lost cat, but Susan had seemed unsettled by the encounter. There was something off about it. "Frank," she'd said over breakfast the next morning, "he was standing right by Katie's window, and when I asked about the cat, he couldn't remember what it looked like." What kind of person doesn't remember their own pet? Frank had been more interested in his coffee and newspaper than his daughter-in-law's concerns. Maybe he was just embarrassed about losing track of the animal. "You women read too much into everything." The casual sexism of that comment burned now as Frank remembered the hurt look that had crossed Susan's face. She'd been trying to protect Katie, trying to voice legitimate concerns about a potential threat, and Frank had dismissed her intuition as feminine hysteria. Rex had suddenly stopped on a ridge overlooking the old Morrison property, his body going rigid with alertness. The dog's hackles had risen, and that low, dangerous growl had started in his chest, the same sound he made whenever Henderson appeared. "What is it, boy?" Frank had whispered, scanning the valley below. "What do you see?" That's when they'd heard Katie's scream echoing off the canyon walls, thin and terrified and absolutely heartbreaking. Frank's blood had turned to ice water as adrenaline flooded his system. She was down there somewhere, and she was in trouble. The descent into the valley had been treacherous, loose rocks and steep slopes that threatened to send them both tumbling into the ravine below, but Rex had navigated the terrain with sure-footed confidence, occasionally looking back to make sure Frank was still following. The dog's urgency had been palpable. He knew they were running out of time. As they'd gotten closer to the source of Katie's cries, more memories had assaulted Frank's consciousness. The time Henderson had offered to give Katie rides to school when Susan's car was in the shop, the way he'd always seemed to know Katie's schedule better than her own family did. The casual questions about when Susan worked late shifts, when Frank went to his VA appointments, when Katie would be home alone. All the signs had been there, a predator circling his prey, gathering intelligence, waiting for the perfect opportunity. And Frank had been so focused on being a good neighbor, on maintaining social conventions, that he'd ignored every warning his family and his dog had tried to give him. The clearing where they'd found the overturned truck had been a scene from Frank's worst nightmares. Katie, trapped in the cab, Henderson standing over her with that stolen Ranger uniform and that terrible smile, and the sudden understanding that this had all been planned from the very beginning. "You led me quite a chase, Frank," Henderson had said as Rex positioned himself between the armed man and Katie. "But I suppose it's fitting that you're here for the finale. After all, this is partly your fault." The words had hit Frank like physical blows, because Henderson was right. Frank's willful blindness, his refusal to listen to the warnings, had created the opportunity for this monster to strike every dismissed concern, every ignored instinct. Every time he'd scolded Rex for growling at their neighbor had been another brick in the path that led to this moment. Katie's terrified face in the truck window, Henderson's gun, Rex coiled to attack, and Frank finally understanding that sometimes being a good neighbor meant recognizing when your neighbor was actually A wolf in sheep's clothing, the afternoon sun had been declining toward the mountain peaks, and Frank had known that darkness would bring new dangers. Whatever Henderson had planned for Katie, it would be easier to accomplish under cover of night. Time was running out, and Frank was about to learn just how far a good dog would go to protect an innocent child. The truth hit Frank like a sledgehammer to the chest as he stared at Henderson's casual smile. This wasn't Katie's first encounter with their neighbor. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. All those times Henderson had shown up at just the right moment. All those casual questions about Katie's schedule, all those friendly waves from across the property line. "You've been planning this for months?" Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. The realization made his stomach churn with a mixture of rage and self-loathing. All those visits, all those neighborly chats. Henderson chuckled, a sound that made Rex's growling intensify. "Oh, Frank, months, try years. I've been watching that little girl since she was barely walking. Such a pretty child and so trusting. She actually waved back at me every single time, sweet as pie, just like her daddy." Was the casual mention of Katie's father, Frank's son David, killed in Afghanistan, sent a surge of murderous rage through the old veteran's veins. But it was Henderson's next words that truly revealed the scope of his depravity. "David used to play in these same woods when he was Katie's age, didn't he, back when your family still owned this property? I remember watching him too all those years ago. Shame he grew up before I could really get to know him." The implication was clear, and Frank felt bile rise in his throat. Henderson had been hunting in these mountains for decades. David had unknowingly escaped a predator's attention simply by growing too old, but now Henderson had set his sights on the next generation. "You sick son of a bitch!" Frank snarled, his hand inching toward the .45 on his hip. "You stay away from my family." "Oh, but Frank, your family is exactly why I'm here." Henderson's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too white, too perfect. "Katie is such a special little girl, so full of life, so curious about the world. I've been looking forward to teaching her about things." Rex had heard enough. The German shepherd lunged forward with lightning speed, but Henderson had been expecting it. The gun swung toward the dog, and Frank's heart stopped as he realized what was about to happen. "No!" Frank shouted, throwing himself sideways just as Henderson pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. Rex yelped and tumbled to the ground, blood immediately soaking his black and tan coat, but the dog's sacrifice had given Frank the opening he needed. The old veteran tackled Henderson around the waist, sending both men crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs. At 73, Frank was no match for a man 20 years younger, but rage gave him strength he didn't know he still possessed. They rolled across the rocky ground, fighting for control of the pistol. Henderson was stronger, but Frank had desperation on his side, the primal fury of a grandfather protecting his blood. "Katie!" Frank yelled as they struggled. "Are you hurt, honey, grandpa, buddy?" Katie's voice was thin with terror, but she was conscious and responding. "I'm stuck, the door won't open." Frank managed to get his hand on Henderson's wrist, forcing the gun away from both of them, but his opponent was younger and had the advantage of leverage. Henderson drove his knee into Frank's bad leg, sending agony shooting through the old man's body. "Should have minded your own business, Frank." Henderson panted as they grappled. "Could have just stayed home and let nature take its course. But no, you had to play the hero. That's what grandfathers do." Frank gasped, fighting through the pain. "We protect our own." Henderson managed to break free and scrambled for the fallen pistol, but Rex wasn't finished. Despite his wound, the German shepherd dragged himself across the ground and sank his teeth into Henderson's ankle. The man screamed and kicked at the dog, but Rex held on with grim determination. Frank seized the opportunity to lunge for the gun, his arthritic fingers closing around the grip just as Henderson broke free from Rex's bite. The two men faced each other across the clearing, both breathing hard, both knowing that only one of them was walking away from this confrontation. "You don't understand," Henderson said, his neighborly mask finally slipping completely. "I've been doing this for 30 years. 30 years. Frank, do you know how many children I've taught, how many families I've enriched with my attention?" The words made Frank's blood run cold. This wasn't Henderson's first victim. It wasn't even close. The man was describing a career, a lifetime of predation that had somehow gone undetected in small mountain communities where people trusted their neighbors. Katie's going to be special. Henderson continued, his eyes gleaming with a fervor that bordered on religious mania. I've been planning her education for years, all the things I'm going to show her, all the ways she's going to learn to please me. She understand eventually, they all do. Frank's finger tightened on the trigger. He'd killed men before in Vietnam, but that had been war. This was different. This was personal. This was about protecting the most precious thing in his world from a monster who wore a human face. But Katie was watching from the overturned truck, and Frank couldn't bring himself to commit murder. In front of his granddaughter, some lines couldn't be uncrossed, even in the name of justice. "You're going to put that gun down," Frank said instead, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "You're going to step away from my granddaughter. And you're going to wait for the sheriff like a civilized human being." Henderson laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Civilized, Frank? There's nothing civilized about what I do to little girls, and there's nothing civilized about what I'm going to do to Katie once I deal with you and that damn dog." That's when Frank noticed the photos scattered around the clearing, Polaroids that must have fallen from Henderson's truck during the crash. His stomach lurched as he realized what he was looking at. Pictures of children, dozens of them, all young, all frightened, all bearing the unmistakable signs of abuse. Katie wasn't Henderson's first victim. She was just the latest in a long line of children who disappeared into these mountains and never been seen again. "Dear God," Frank whispered, his hands trembling as the full scope of Henderson's crimes became clear. How many children does it matter?" Henderson shrugged, as if they were discussing the whether they served their purpose. "Just like Katie will serve hers. The only question is whether you're going to make this easy or hard on yourself." Frank looked at Rex, who was still bleeding but trying to stand still, ready to fight despite his wounds. He looked at Katie, trapped and terrified, but trusting her grandfather to save her. He looked at the photographs scattered across the ground like fallen leaves, each one representing a family destroyed, a life stolen, a future erased. The choice was simple. Frank raised the .45 and pointed it directly at Henderson's chest. "You're right about one thing," he said quietly. "There's nothing civilized about what you do to children, but there's something even less civilized about what I'm going to do to you if you take one more step toward my granddaughter." Henderson's smile faltered. For the first time in Frank's eyes, he saw something that made his predator's instincts scream danger. This wasn't just an angry grandfather. This was a combat veteran who killed before and wouldn't hesitate to kill again. "Now step away from the truck," Frank commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd faced down death and lived to tell about it. "And keep your hands where I can see them." But Henderson had one more card to play, and Frank was about to learn that some monsters would rather destroy everything than surrender. "You kill me, Frank, and you'll never find the others," Henderson said softly. "The children who are still alive, still waiting for someone to rescue them." Frank's blood turned to ice as the implication sank in. Somewhere in these mountains, other children were imprisoned, waiting for a rescue that might never come. The gun trembled in his hands as he faced an impossible choice. The photographs scattered across the ground told a story that made Frank's soul recoil in horror. Dozens of Polaroids, some yellowed with age, others still sharp with recent development. Children's faces stared up at him from the rocky earth, some defiant, some terrified, all heartbreakingly young. Frank's military training kicked in, automatically cataloging details, even as his grandfather's heart shattered with each image. "You recognize some of them, don't you?" Henderson's voice carried a sick pride, like an artist displaying his life's work. "Little Tommy Chun from Fairfield disappeared during a camping trip 5 years ago. Sarah McKenna from Pine Valley vanished from her backyard 3 summers back. The authorities called them isolated incidents, tragic accidents, but you and I know better, don't we?" Frank's hand shook as he kept the .45 trained on Henderson's chest. Each name was a dagger to his conscience. He remembered those cases, remembered the search parties, the grieving families, the way the community had rallied around the parents before eventually moving on when the trails went cold. All those children, all those families destroyed, and the monster responsible had been living right next door. "Where are they?" Frank's voice came out as a rasp. "The one still alive? Where are you keeping them?" Henderson's smile was a study and calculated. "Cruelty, oh, Frank, that's information that dies with me, unless, of course, we can come to some sort of arrangement from the overturned truck." Katie's voice pierced the mountain air. "Grandpa, buddy, there's something scary in here with me." Frank's blood froze. "What do you mean, honey?" What kind of scary pictures? Lots of pictures of kids, and they all look sad and scared, and there's a big map with red marks all over it. Henderson's mobile command center, Frank, realized with dawning horror that the crash truck wasn't just transportation, it was a rolling archive of 30 years of predation. Maps marking hunting grounds, photographs documenting victims, probably detailed. Records of every child this monster had destroyed. Quite the collection, isn't it? Henderson said conversationally, 30 years of careful work, detailed documentation. I'm very thorough in my research. Rex had managed to drag himself closer to the truck, leaving a trail of blood across. The rocky ground the German shepherd's breathing was labored, but his amber eyes remained focused on. Henderson, with laser intensity, even wounded, dying the dog, understood his mission: protect Katie at all costs. Frank's mind raced through the tactical situation. Henderson was unarmed now, but Frank was 73 years old, with a bad leg and failing reflexes. If this turned into a physical confrontation, the younger man would have every advantage, but the real horror was psychological. The knowledge that other children were suffering somewhere in these mountains while Frank stood paralyzed by an impossible choice. You wanted to know the beautiful thing about isolation? Henderson continued, gesturing toward the wilderness around them. These mountains are full of abandoned mines, forgotten cabins, places where a man can pursue his interests without interference. Some of my young friends have been waiting for me for days now. They must be getting quite hungry. The casual way Henderson discussed starving children made Frank's trigger finger twitch. Every instinct screamed at him to end this monster's existence, to put a bullet through his heart and sort out the consequences later. But Katie was watching. And somewhere in these mountains, innocent children were depending on Henderson's survival for their own. You're bluffing, Frank said, though his voice lacked conviction. If there were really other kids, you wouldn't risk telling me, would I? Henderson's eyes glittered with malicious amusement. Think about it, Frank. What do I have to lose at this point? You've already discovered my operation. The authorities will come looking eventually. My only leverage is those children, and we both know you're too much of a Boy Scout to let them die for the sake of justice. Frank's military training weared with his grandfather's instincts in Vietnam. The choice would have been simple: eliminate the threat and move on. But this wasn't a war zone, and Henderson wasn't an enemy soldier. This was a calculation that involved innocent lives hanging in the balance. Let me tell you about little Amy Rodriguez, Henderson said, his voice taking on a storyteller's cadence. 8 years old, missing from her family's campsite for 6 days now. She's in an old mine shaft about 3 miles north of here, secured but unharmed for now. But my young friends have very specific feeding schedules, and I'm already quite late for our appointment. Frank felt sweat beading on his forehead. Despite the mountain chill, Henderson was playing him like a master manipulator, using Frank's own decency as a weapon against him. The predator understood that a good man's conscience could be his greatest weakness. Then there's Michael Patterson, Henderson continued. Disappeared from a Boy Scout camping trip last month. He's proving quite resistant to my educational methods, but hunger has a way of making children more cooperative. Stop. Frank whispered, the words tearing from his throat like broken glass. Just stop. Oh, but we're just getting started. Henderson said, did you know that Katie has been asking questions about her daddy lately, about how soldiers die in faraway places? I could teach her so much about death, Frank, so much about pain, and less of course you'd prefer I focus my attention on the children who are already under my care. Frank's vision went red at the edges. Henderson wasn't just describing future crimes. He was outlining a deliberate campaign of psychological torture designed to break a grandfather's will. The monster had studied Frank's weaknesses and was exploiting them with surgical precision. Rex whimpered from his position near the truck, and Frank realized the dog was trying to tell him something. The German shepherd's nose was pointed toward a specific direction in the forest, and his hackles were raised despite his wounds. Rex had caught a scent, detected something that his human senses couldn't perceive. You smell them too, don't you, boy? Henderson noticed the dog's behavior. My other young friends aren't too far away, close enough for their cries to carry on the wind when they get really desperate. Frank strained his ears but heard nothing except the mountain breeze through the pines. But Rex's instincts were legendary, and if the dog sensed other children nearby, then Henderson might be telling the truth about his captives. Here's what's going to happen. Henderson said, his voice taking on the tone of someone negotiating a business deal. "You're going to put down that gun and help me get Katie out of that truck? Then we're all going to take a little walk to visit my other young friends. You can verify that they're real, that they're alive, and that they're completely dependent on my continued breathing for their survival." And then Frank asked, though he dreaded the answer, "Then you're going to have to make some very difficult choices about whose life matters more, your granddaughter's future happiness or the continued existence of children you've never met. It's a fascinating moral equation, isn't it?" Frank looked at Katie's terrified face in the truck window, then at Rex bleeding in the dirt, then at the scattered photographs of Henderson's previous victims. 30 years of predation, dozens of destroyed lives, families torn apart by a monster who'd hidden behind the mask of a friendly neighbor. The weight of the .45 felt enormous in his hands. One squeeze of the trigger, and Henderson's reign of terror would end forever, but with his death would go any chance of rescuing the children he claimed to be holding captive. "You're enjoying this," Frank realized with sickening clarity. "You get off on the psychological torture as much as the physical crimes." A perceptive observation, Henderson nodded approvingly. "The anticipation is often more exquisite than the actual event, the knowledge that good people will compromise their principles, betray their own values, all for the sake of protecting innocence. It's beautiful in its own way." Frank felt something break inside him, not his resolve, but his last illusion about the nature of evil. Henderson wasn't just a predator hunting children, he was something far worse, a creature who fed on the moral anguish of decent people, who found pleasure in forcing good men to make impossible choices. "Time's wasting, Frank," Henderson said, glancing at the declining sun. "My young friends will be getting quite anxious for their dinner, and little Amy Rodriguez has such a lovely voice when she's really frightened." Frank's finger tightened on the trigger as he faced the most important decision of his life. The sound that shattered the mountain silence wasn't Frank's gunshot. It was the roar of helicopter rotors cutting through the thin air above the canyon. Sheriff Daniels had finally mobilized the search and rescue teams, and their arrival changed everything in an instant. Henderson's confident smile faltered as he realized his carefully orchestrated psychological torture was about to be interrupted. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank muttered, keeping the .45 trained on Henderson while stealing a glance at the sky. "Cavalry is here after all." But Henderson's reaction wasn't what Frank expected. Instead of panic or resignation, the predator's face lit up with something close to relief. "Actually, Frank, this is perfect timing, you see. I've been preparing for this moment for quite some time." The helicopter began its descent into the clearing rotor wash, scattering the photographs of Henderson's victims like makeup confetti. Frank had to squint against the flying debris, but he never let his aim waver from Henderson's chest. Whatever the monster was planning, Frank wasn't going to give him an opening. "You think rescue changes anything?" Henderson shouted over the noise of the aircraft. "You think your government friends are going to help those children?" "I mentioned Frank, you naive old fool. Some of my best customers wear badges." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. The implication was staggering that Henderson's network of predation reached into law enforcement itself, that the very people sworn to protect children might be complicit in their exploitation. "You're lying," Frank said, but even as the words left his mouth, doubt crept into his voice. Henderson's confidence in the face of capture suggested resources that went beyond what a lone predator should possess. The helicopter touched down, and Frank recognized the pilot as Deputy Martinez from the county sheriff's department, but something was wrong with the scene. Instead of rushing to secure Henderson or check on Katie's condition, Martinez remained at the controls while two men in expensive suits climbed out of the aircraft. Rex whimpered from his position near the truck, the sound barely audible over the dying rotor noise. The German shepherd's instincts were screaming danger, and Frank had learned to trust the dog's judgment above his own. "Mr. Morrison." One of the suited men called out, his voice carrying an authority that made Frank's military instincts snap to attention. "I'm Agent Carson, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I need you to lower your weapon immediately." Frank's blood ran cold. Federal agents arriving by helicopter within hours of Henderson's capture suggested a level of coordination that spoke to Henderson's earlier claims about official protection. This wasn't a rescue, it was damage control. "The hell I will." Frank replied, adjusting his grip on the .45. This man is a child predator. He's been operating in these mountains for 30 years, and he claims to have other victims hidden somewhere. Agent Carson exchanged a meaningful glance with his partner before speaking again. Mr. Morrison, you're interfering with an ongoing federal investigation, Mr. Henderson is a valuable asset in our efforts to dismantle a larger network of criminals. Asset? Frank's voice cracked with disbelief. This monster has been murdering children, and you're calling him an asset? Henderson's laughter echoed off the canyon walls. Oh, Frank, did you really think I was working alone 30 years of operation without getting caught? That kind of longevity requires friends in high places. The second agent, a younger man with dead eyes and an expensive haircut, stepped forward with his hands raised in a peaceful gesture. No, Morrison, we understand your emotional investment in this situation. Your granddaughter's safety is our primary concern, but you need to understand that Mr. Henderson's cooperation is essential to saving literally dozens of other children. Frank felt the world tilting beneath his feet. The federal agents weren't here to arrest Henderson, they were here to protect him. The monster had been telling the truth about his connections, about the network that shielded him from consequences. Katie. Frank called toward the overturned truck. Are you okay, honey? I'm scared. Grandpa, buddy? Katie's voice was thin with terror. These men are saying bad words about you. Frank's jaw tightened, whatever was happening here. His granddaughter didn't need to witness it, but with federal agents blocking his escape routes and Henderson still free, Frank's options were rapidly disappearing. Let me explain the situation, Agent Carson said, his tone taking on the patient cadence of someone addressing a confused child. Mr. Henderson has been operating under federal oversight for the past 5 years. His activities, while regrettable, have provided us with intelligence about a much larger organization. We're on the verge of a breakthrough that could save hundreds of children by sacrificing the ones he's already taken. Frank's voice rose with each word. By letting him continue his activities while you gather intelligence. Henderson stepped closer to Agent Carson, and Frank noticed how the federal agent automatically positioned himself as a shield between Frank's gun and the predator. The body language told Frank everything he needed to know about where these men's loyalties lay. Frank, Henderson said, his neighborly mask sliding back into place like a well-worn costume. I tried to explain this to you earlier. Sometimes individual sacrifices are necessary for the greater good. Your granddaughter's education could provide us with valuable insights into childhood trauma responses. Rex somehow found the strength to growl despite his wounds, the sound carrying a primal warning that resonated in Frank's bones. The dog understood what Frank was beginning to realize. They were all alone here, surrounded by predators who wore badges and spoke the language of justice, while serving darker masters, the children Henderson claims to be holding. Frank said, his tactical mind working through the implications. They're part of your operation too. Aren't they not victims waiting for rescue, but assets in your intelligence gathering? Agent Carson's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Mr. Morrison, you're beginning to understand the complexity of the situation. National security sometimes requires difficult choices. National security. Frank's laugh held no humor. You're using that as an excuse to traffic children. The younger agent's hand moved toward his jacket, and Frank caught the motion in his peripheral vision. More weapons in play, more complications in an already impossible situation. But Frank had been in hopeless tactical situations before, and he'd learned that sometimes the only way out was through. Here's what's going to happen, Frank said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd faced down death and lived to tell about it. Katie's getting out of that truck. Rex is getting medical attention, and I'm walking out of these mountains with my family intact. I'm afraid that's not possible. Agent Carson replied, you've seen too much, learned too much about ongoing operations. National security considerations require that this situation be contained. Frank understood. The euphemism contained meant silenced permanently. These weren't federal agents conducting legitimate operations. They were criminal enforcers dressed in the costume of authority. You know what the funny thing is, Frank said, surprising everyone with his conversational tone. I spent 50 years believing in the system, believing that good guys wore badges and followed the law, but Rex here taught me something important about reading people. The German shepherd raised his head at the sound of his name, amber eyes still focused on Henderson despite his pain. Dogs don't lie, Frank continued. They can't be bought, or corrupted, or convinced to ignore their instincts for the sake of political convenience. And Rex has been trying to tell me for months that Henderson was dangerous. Frank's finger tightened on the trigger as he made his choice. Maybe it's time. I started listening to my dog instead of trusting in badges. The mountain air held its breath as predators faced protector in a confrontation that would end with either justice or tragedy. But Frank Morrison had one advantage: his enemies didn't expect the desperate courage of a grandfather who'd already lost everything that mattered. Except the little girl trapped in that overturned truck, the truth that saved them all came from the most unexpected source. Katie herself, from inside the overturned truck, her young voice cut through the mountain tension like a knife through silk. Grandpa Buddy, Rex isn't dying. He's pretending. Frank's heart nearly stopped as he processed his granddaughter's words. Pretending, but even as confusion flooded his mind, he caught Rex's subtle movement. The German shepherd had shifted position slightly, no longer bleeding as heavily as before. The dog's amber eyes met Frank's for just an instant, and in them Frank saw not the glazed look of a dying animal, but the sharp intelligence of a military working dog executing a tactical maneuver. Rex had been playing possum, conserving his strength while gathering information about their enemies. Henderson's confident smile faltered as he realized what the child had observed. "Shut her up," he snarled at Agent Carson, the little brat, as Rex exploded into action with lightning speed that caught everyone off guard. The German shepherd launched himself not at Henderson but at the younger agent who'd been reaching for his weapon. 90 pounds of trained military muscle collided with the man's chest, sending him tumbling backward into the rocky ground. "Son of a bitch," Agent Carson shouted, drawing his pistol, but Frank was already moving. 73 years old or not, Frank Morrison had been a soldier before he'd been a grandfather. His shot took Agent Carson's center mass, the .45 bucking in his weathered hands with familiar authority. The corrupt federal agent dropped like a stone, his badge clattering across the rocky ground. Henderson tried to run, but Rex was already on him, the dog's teeth closed around the predator's wrist with surgical precision, not to kill but to hold. Henderson screamed and tried to shake free, but Rex's grip was unbreakable. "Katie," Frank called toward the truck. "Are you hurt, honey?" "I'm okay, Grandpa Buddy, but I'm still stuck." Frank kept his gun trained on the younger agent while moving toward the overturned vehicle. The man was conscious but winded, his expensive suit torn and dirty from Rex's attack. Blood seeped from claw marks on his chest, where the dog's assault had found its target. "Don't move," Frank warned him. "I've got enough bullets for everyone who needs killing today." The pilot, Deputy Martinez, had started to climb out of the helicopter, but Frank's steady aim in his direction changed the man's mind. Quickly, Martinez raised his hands and stayed put, his face pale with the realization that his corruption had been exposed. "Please," Frank Henderson whimpered from where Rex held him pinned. "You don't understand the scope of what you're destroying. This operation reaches all the way to Washington. Important people depend on the intelligence we gather." "Intelligence?" Frank spat. "You mean the sexual exploitation of children, call it what it is, you piece of garbage." Frank reached the truck and began working to free Katie from the twisted metal. The door was jammed, but adrenaline gave him strength he didn't know he still possessed. With a grunt of effort that sent pain shooting through his bad leg, he managed to wrench the passenger door open. Katie tumbled into his arms, and Frank felt his heart finally start beating normally again. She was dirty and scared, but she was whole, she was safe, she was home. "I knew you'd come, Grandpa Buddy," she whispered against his neck. "Rex told me you would." "Rex told you?" Frank pulled back to look at his granddaughter's face. "Honey, dogs can't talk." Katie's smile held the wisdom that sometimes came to children who'd seen too much, not with words, but he kept looking at me like he was saying, "Don't worry, my human will fix this." And he was right. Frank's radio crackled to life. "The real sheriff Danielle's calling from the base of the mountain, Frank. We've got state police and genuine federal agents on the way up to your location, Deputy. Martinez's helicopter went dark 20 minutes ago, and we're treating this as a hostage situation." Frank keyed the radio with one hand while keeping his gun trained on the surviving criminals with the other. "Bob, this is Frank's situation is under control. I've got Katie safe, but we're going to need medical attention for Rex and Bob when those federal agents get here. Make sure they're the real deal. We've had some imposters causing trouble. Copy that. Frank. Ada is 15 minutes. Henderson was still whimpering under Rex's grip, but the predators' eyes held a cunning that made Frank nervous. Even caught and exposed, the monster was looking for an angle, searching for a way to turn the situation to his advantage. You think this is over? Henderson said, his voice gaining strength. You think killing a couple of agents changes anything? Frank, I've been documenting my activities for 30 years. Every child, every encounter, every detail. That information is worth millions to the right buyers. Frank felt ice form in his stomach. What are you saying? Insurance. Frank detailed records hidden where only I can find them. Videos, photographs, personal information about every family I've ever visited. If anything happens to me, all of that material gets released to the highest biders. The magnitude of Henderson's evil was staggering. Not content with destroying children's lives directly, he created a system to ensure their exploitation would continue even after his death. Where Frank demanded, where are the records? Henderson's laugh was like broken glass. Safe deposit boxes in 3 different states, digital copies and encrypted drives scattered across the country. Even if you kill me, Frank, my work will live on forever. Rex's growl intensified, and Frank realized the dog understood more of human speech than most people gave him credit for. The German Shepherd's amber eyes held a promise of violence that transcended species barriers. But Henderson continued, I might be willing to destroy those records in exchange for certain considerations, such as my freedom, and Katie comes with me as insurance for my safe passage. Frank's vision went red around the edges. The audacity of the demand. The casual way Henderson spoke about taking Katie, the sheer evil of using a child as a bargaining chip. It was more than any grandfather could bear. Rex, Frank said quietly, release. The German Shepherd immediately let go of Henderson's wrist and stepped back, but his position was calculated. Rex had positioned himself to attack again if necessary. His body coiled like a spring, ready to launch. Henderson started to stand, rubbing his wounded wrist, a smile of triumph beginning to form on his lips. He thought he'd won, thought his leverage had secured his freedom. Frank shot him twice in the chest. Henderson's body hit the ground with a wet thud, his eyes wide with surprise and already glazing over. Whatever evil he'd planned to continue, whatever records he'd hidden, whatever children he might have harmed in the future, all of it died with him in the Colorado mountains. Grandpa, buddy, Katie said softly, is the bad man gone? Frank holstered his pistol and gathered his granddaughter into his arms. Yes, honey. The bad man is gone forever. Rex limped over to them, his wounds real, but not life-threatening. The dog's tail wagged weakly as Frank reached down to scratch behind his ears. Good boy, Frank whispered. You did real good. Rex in the distance. The sound of approaching helicopters echoed off the canyon walls. The real rescue teams, the legitimate authorities, the people who would help them piece together the aftermath of Henderson's 30-year reign of terror. Frank looked down at Henderson's body and felt no regret, no guilt, no second thoughts. Some monsters didn't deserve trials or plea bargains or psychological evaluations. Some monsters just needed to be put down like the rabid animals they were. Well, I'll be damned, Frank said softly, holding Katie close while Rex pressed against his legs. Sometimes an old dog really can learn new tricks. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and freedom, and for the first time in 3 days, Frank Morrison felt like he could breathe again. His family was safe, the monster was dead, and justice for once had been served, exactly as it should be. Well, friends, let me tell you something that every grandparent in America needs to hear tonight. This story isn't just about one old man and his dog. It's about all of us who've spent our lives building something worth protecting. We raised our kids right, served our country when called, worked honest jobs, and paid our taxes. We believed the system would protect what mattered most, but sometimes, just sometimes, that system fails us when we need it most. Frank Morrison learned what too many of us discover too late, that evil doesn't always look like a stranger in a dark alley. Sometimes it wears a friendly face, brings you cookies at Christmas and waves from across the fence. Sometimes it's the neighbor you trusted, the official you respected, the very people sworn to protect our grandchildren. But here's what gives me hope, and what should give you hope too. When everything else failed, love didn't fail. A grandfather's determination, a loyal Dog's courage and the little girl's trust, that's what saved the day, but not badges or bureaucrats or fancy federal agents, just family doing what family does. Best protecting each other when the chips are down and the world shows its true colors.